Shabbat Shalom. I hope everyone's enjoying the rest day. I know I am after a long week. This week we're in the portion Tsav, which is a continuation of last week's where we started introducing the sacrifices. And it's a shorter portion. It's Leviticus chapter 6 through 8, so the entireties of chapter 6, 7, and 8. And this just gives a bit more detail about how the sacrifices are to take place. And so last week's portion, we saw the introduction of the sacrifices, the different types, the sin offering, the guilt offering, the free will offering, the burnt offering. This portion goes into a bit more detail about how each is to be performed and what's to happen with the meat and the fat afterwards. Now, I didn't have as much revelation from this portion, and I think it's just a reflection of where I am and my understanding and how much more I have to learn when it comes to this. Probably has some lesson in there about where I'm at in my spiritual walk. But there were a couple interesting things that popped out to me. Some of them are things that I just am still a little confused about, but I think they're significant, and others are just things that I found actually interesting. The first one being in chapter 6, verses 7 through 9, I'm going to read it. This is the ritual for the meal offering. Aaron's sons shall present it before Yahweh in front of the altar. A handful of the choice flour and oil of the meal offering shall be taken, with all the frankincense that's on the top, and this token portion shall be turned into smoke on the altar as a pleasing odor to Yahweh. What's left of it shall be eaten by Aaron and his sons. It shall be eaten as unleavened cakes in the sacred precinct. They shall eat it in the enclosure of the tent of meeting. So what we see as a recurring theme here is that portions of the offerings go to Aaron and his sons, and this is how they eat. I think that eating also is really important as sealing of covenants, of promise, of agreements. And so I think it is really significant that we see that the priests are eating these meals, or portions of these meals, portions of this offering to Yahweh, given their position as the one who mediates the offering, which is for the cleansing of the person, the cleansing of the altar, or just a peace offering or some offering that somebody wants to give to Yahweh to become closer to him. What I find very interesting, though, is that the priests actually do not eat their own meal offering. So also in chapter 6, verse 16, this is right after talking about how to prepare the priest's meal offering. And in 16 it says, "So too every meal offering of a priest shall be a whole offering. It shall not be eaten." So it's turned entirely into smoke. The whole thing goes up to Yahweh. And I find this very interesting. I'm not sure what the total significance of it is, but I'm sure it's connected with the priest status as priest, their more holy status compared to the rest of the community, and the fact that they are the ones acting as the intercessors between the people and Yahweh for effecting the sacrifices. Now in chapter 8, verse 15, you've probably heard me say this multiple times across multiple Torah portions, which is the purpose of sacrifices, or at least some of them, is to cleanse the altar of our sin, as well as to cleanse us from our sin, so that Yahweh can be in our presence. And this verse, chapter 8, verse 15, is where this is coming from. Of course, I had been hearing it from teachers that have a much greater understanding of this than I do. But this is the verse where it comes from, or at least one of them. And says, "Moses took the blood and with his finger put some on each of the horns of the altar, cleansing the altar. Then he poured out the blood at the base of the altar. Thus he consecrated it in order to make expiation upon it." So it says right here that the blood is for the cleansing of the altar. The meaning of the Hebrew word that's translated consecrated here also means clean or cleanse. It has the idea of cleansing. And for making expiation is covering or purge or making atonement. We talked about this Hebrew word in the last Torah portion. And so right here we see that the sacrifice there, and the blood of the sacrifice specifically, has a cleansing property that then allows the altar to be used as a covering for the people's sins. And so I think that's a really beautiful illustration there. And of course we can connect it to Messiah with the spillage of his blood and the covering of our sins. Now then we go into the last portion of this portion, a lot of portions, is they've already been told how to anoint and consecrate Aaron and his sons for service in the temple. Now they're actually doing it. So this is the explanation of doing it. It's really interesting to me, the order of these 3 offerings. So there's 3 offerings that they go through: the sin offering, the burnt offering, and then the ordination offering. If you remember from last week, the sin offering, of course, is the offering for sin. It's to cleanse from sin. If the priest is going to be doing that for the people, the priest has to be the first person to be cleansed. But the burnt offering is the one that is like an ascension offering. It's like a sign of us ascending into the presence of Yahweh. And this is exactly what they're going to be doing, because they're in the tabernacle officiating, and they're in areas of the tabernacle that not just anybody could be in. They're much, much closer to Yahweh's presence than the rest of the people. And then it's the ordination offering. So it's very interesting to me that these first 2, the sin and the burnt offering, first you cleanse from sin, then you get closer to Yahweh, are required before you can even be set apart for the priesthood. Now, in the New Covenant or the New Testament writings, it says that we are a kingdom of priests. We are going to be a priesthood. And so we should look at this pattern and apply it to our own lives. We must be cleansed from sin, and we must ascend closer to Him before we can even hope to have such a serious status as being a priest for Yahweh. Now, the ordination offering is interesting to me, because in chapter 8, verse 29, we see that Moshe himself had a portion of it. So now it's not just the priest and the priest's sons eating it, but Moses as well. And his portion is the breast. So it says in 29, Moses took the breast and elevated it as an elevation offering before Yahweh. It was Moses' portion of the ram of ordination, as Yahweh had commanded Moses. And so again, we see that although Moses himself is not the one serving as the priesthood in the tabernacle, he does have a status that is set apart, and he has ability to be in the presence of Yahweh that isn't, in his case, not just reserved for the priest, because he's not an officiating priest, but he has some status. And we've seen this before in different areas of the Torah, as well as when he's the one who actually built the tabernacle. Other people were the ones who built the materials for it, but he's the one who assembled everything and put everything together. And so I find it very interesting and significant that he also has his own portion of the ordination offering, which was meant for Aaron and his sons. Now in verse 31, what we see here is that Moses says to Aaron and his sons, boil the flesh. This is the ordination offering. Boil the flesh at the entrance of the tent of meeting and eat it there with the bread that is in the basket of ordination. And what is left over you shall consume in the fire. And so again, this goes back to the theme of eating to seal covenants, or as symbol of covenants or as agreements. And so by doing this whole process, Aaron and his sons are entering into an agreement with Yahweh that this is going to be their job. This is what they're going to do. And they're doing this for the community of Israel. And it's a very serious undertaking, literally a life and death matter, not just for the people, but for them, as we'll find out in a future Torah portion. And in verse 35, which is almost at the very end of this portion, we see that this whole process, these 3 offerings, the sin, the burnt, and the ordination offering, are to take place every day for 7 days. And what's very interesting is, as this is happening, they're not to leave. So they're to remain at the entrance of the tent of meeting day and night for 7 days. And it says, keeping Yahweh's charge, that they may not die. And this was curious. I looked up the Hebrew words for keeping and charge, and their meanings are very, very similar. They both have this idea of guarding, of watching. And so the only thing that I can think of here is I have this picture of a sentry guard in my mind. And it kind of brings me back to the trees in the garden as well. Remember, the cherubim was set to guard the garden and to watch it and to not allow sin, essentially, to penetrate. Man had to be kept out. And I get the same feeling here that until everything is complete, until everything's cleansed, the priests have to keep anything out that could interrupt this process of purification. They have to guard it. They're guarding the tabernacle, and they're keeping watch over the altar and making sure that whatever purification and cleansing happened that day is not being disrupted, and the whole 7 days have to happen. Otherwise, it's ruined. You can't have the priesthood and you can't have the altar and service. It has to go this way for 7 days. This is what Yahweh commanded. And this is kind of the thought that I had. You could also maybe parallel with it as like as a dress rehearsal for their job as a whole from here on out, which is to guard the tabernacle and protect it and cleanse it from sin and the stain of sin. And it says, so that you may not die. My guess is that if anything were to come in and mar it, to take away the purity and interrupt this process of setting them apart for service, they then would be considered unfit and they would be killed. They would have to die, just because it's this idea of impurity in the face of purity, and they can't reside together in the same place. There's probably more to it than that. I wouldn't be surprised if there was, and I'm really curious to see what it is. So again, as always, if you have any comments or thoughts on this, if you've learned something from your own study or from a teacher, please feel free to share it in the comments on the video. A much shorter discourse from me today, but this is what I got out of the portion today. So you can see that every week for me is different, and I'm completely transparent about where I am on my walk. So this is teaching me a lot as well. So have a blessed Shabbat and a blessed week, especially as you prepare for Passover this week. Shabbat Shalom.